We just listened to two beautiful and different stories about the same event. And it's an event that is pretty important to the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus after he is crucified and laid to rest. Rachel told the resurrection story from the Gospel of Matthew, which says that when Mary Magdalene and another Mary arrived at the tomb, an angel descended from the heavens like lightning. The angel says that Jesus is no longer there, that he has been raised, and the disciples should meet Jesus in Galilee. The two Marys run from the tomb with fear and great joy to tell the disciples, and along the way they encounter Jesus before them, who says, "Do not be afraid, that he has returned." Kit told us the resurrection story from the Gospel of John. And according to John, Mary Magdalene arrives at the tomb and discovers that the body of Jesus is missing. So she runs to the disciples and says that they have taken the Lord. The disciples and Mary return to the tomb and see all the linen strewn about, and Jesus' body is not there. And then the story ends with everyone returning home. So there's some pretty clear differences. Matthew's story has an angel. John's story does not. Matthew says that Jesus appeared and spoke to Mary Magdalene and her friend. John's story is stuck in the tomb with the linens and the missing body. And there's more, because the Gospels of Luke and Mark also describe the resurrection in their own words, meaning that in the New Testament, the story of the resurrection of Jesus is told to us in 4 different ways by the 4 Gospels of Luke, Mark, Matthew, and John. So there's 4 different stories about the resurrection. It's surprising to me that when it comes to this event, this pivotal moment in the history of Christianity, that the Bible tells narratives that are distinctly different from one another. In one story, Mary goes to tell the disciples that Jesus is risen, and in another, the body's missing and Mary has no idea what's going on. So, what is the truth? Clearly, these stories are inconsistent. If Mark, John, Matthew, and Luke were all sitting at some table together talking about the resurrection, I wonder what they would think about each other's tales. Would they look at each other with surprise? Would Matthew turn to John and say, "Hey, you forgot the most important part about the angel. Remember, they descended from heaven, and it was magical and white and glorious, and you didn't tell that part at all." The differences between these stories make me wonder about what truly happened in the days after Jesus was buried. Today I want to talk about stories. As Christians, we listen to and learn from stories written in the Bible. And as general people in the world, we listen to and learn from the stories that are told all around us. Stories told by our families, our friends, stories from society and our cultural groups. There are thousands and thousands of stories that we as human beings listen to, discern from, and hold close to us. There are stories from our families. I've heard stories as long as the tale about my grandfather's travels to America, and stories as simple as my sister's tale about her favorite toy in the 4th grade, a pen that had a feathery top with glittery ink that she wrote all of her tales with. In high school, I listened to friends tell stories about school dances and about the mean math teacher we had in the 9th grade. And I know lots of different stories about my female identity. Some I've learned from my grandmother. Others I heard from MTV when I was a teenager. And most recently, I choose to listen to stories about female identity from a website called The Feminist Wire. Stories are how we communicate and how we learn about what's important to each other. When my papa talks about his move from Italy to the United States as a teenager, he talks a lot about his family of 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Papa tells me about his mother sewing clothes for all 7 of them with the same plaid fabric. And his stories usually end with tales about the welcoming neighborhood his family ultimately found in Cranston, Rhode Island, where they all still live today. I know that there are many parts of the transatlantic journey that Papa hasn't told me about. Not because he consciously decides to hide these parts of the story, but because they're not important to him. 60 years later, what Papa has determined to be important about his journey, what he remembers and thinks about to this day, is shared with me through storytelling. From my Papa's stories about his immigration, I've learned that he values family and a welcoming community and the hard work that his mother endured. I think that my Papa speaks the truth about what happened when his family immigrated to America. Yet, if you ask one of his 6 brothers or sisters about the journey, they might tell a different story. Perhaps Uncle Sal would talk about their home in Italy, and Auntie Gloria would talk about the first school that she attended in the United States. This massive transition that they made to America, an event that altered the course of each of their lives, can be recounted in different ways. And all their stories are true. Each story reveals a piece of my family's experience in transitioning to a new country. One story is not more significant or important than another. My aunts and uncles are all talking about the same thing, the same move, yet my Papa and his siblings tell the experience in ways that reflect each of their unique perspectives. And if I miss hearing stories from any one of them, a unique facet of their immigration experience would be lost. When we look at the people around us, we see that there is a rich tapestry of human experience abounding with all different joys and all different struggles. And we tell about these struggles and joys, we tell them to each other in a multitude of different ways. It is beautiful to think about the richness of life, to know that we are all experiencing it differently, and to know that God sustains a world of diversity. And while the multiple stories that depict human experience are beautiful, they are also important. In thinking about the significance of multiple stories, I turned this week to Chimamanda Adichie, a novelist who has influenced my understanding of storytelling. From Chimamanda, I have come to think of stories not just as a means of communication, but as a tool of power and influence. At the beginning of this morning's orders of worship, the quote is from Chimamanda Adichie. The quote reads, "Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. When we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise." Chimamanda says that many stories matter because stories can be used to break people down and stories can be used to lift people up. Stories are powerful enough to influence what we believe about ourselves. They can lead us to feel deprived and degraded, and stories can lead us to feel empowered and uplifted and loved. I want to use an example from my internship this year at El Cerrito High School to explain the power of a story. Sometime this past March, I started meeting with a student in the 10th grade for individual counseling, and I'll refer to her as Tanya. After a few conversations, I noticed that when Tanya talked about school, she included the phrase bad student a lot. I asked Tanya what the word meant and how she came to use the phrase bad student to identify herself and use it in her stories about school. I learned that Tanya had a pretty clear definition of what she understood a bad student to mean. It's someone who doesn't complete her homework, is often absent from class, and is at risk for failing the course. Tanya learned about this definition from her teacher, who called her a bad student, and from her friends, who called themselves bad students. So this is a single story, reinforced by important people in Tanya's life. The power of a single story lies in its ability to permit only one perspective and one outcome. In this case, if Tanya held close to her the single story of being a bad student, then that perspective dictates her future. If Tanya is told repeatedly that being a bad student is her path, then there is no room to see herself at school in a different way. The single story limits Tanya's outcomes to one, course failure. The single story disempowers Tanya because she's not permitted to choose how she's seen by others at school. Tanya cannot choose because the people around her dictating the story, telling her the story repeatedly, have already chosen her identity at school for her. If everyone is willing right now, I'd like to take a moment to think about the stories in our lives and the power of these stories. So for a moment, if you don't mind closing your eyes while we think about this. And right now, I'd like you to think about a word or a phrase that someone labeled you with, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 100 times. And I want it to be a word or a phrase that you didn't really agree with, a word that made you feel disempowered, because that word carries a story with only one perspective and one outcome. A story that made you feel silenced or judged or misunderstood. You can open your eyes now. Stories are constantly being applied to my identity that I don't want, because the narrow view of the single story does not encompass me. Stories are applied to me that I don't want because they have power, and that power can damage me. If people around me think that white females from Connecticut are intelligent and capable human beings, then I feel empowered. But if people think that white women from Connecticut are weak and incapable, then I feel broken down. And there are thousands and thousands of stories, so there are many stories that I've never heard that right now are being used to bring people down, to disempower and subjugate them. Stories are being told that I can't understand because of my white skin, my female identity, and my socioeconomic status. So I wonder what would happen if we made space for more stories. I wonder what is possible if there was room in our world for stories to be multifaceted, for stories to be told openly from multiple perspectives and experiences. Another quote that I love from Chimamanda says, "Our lives, our cultures are composed of many overlapping stories, and if we hear only a single story about another person or country, we risk a critical misunderstanding." When we hear a single story about a person, we mistakenly are led to believe that this is the only way to view them. We mistakenly think that this single perspective is the truth. Like the box that I used during the children's moment. Each person thought that they were seeing the right color, that the truth was right before their eyes. And they're right. The color was there. And when the box turned, there was more. The first color that the child saw wasn't wrong. There were just more colors. And all the colors were the truth. As Christians, we think about the stories in the Bible and we wonder about their meaning. Sometimes we hear people use biblical passages for purposes of exploitation and dispossession and destruction. Sometimes stories from the Bible are used to break the dignity of a group of people and that absolutely breaks my heart, and I know it breaks the heart of many of you. We don't want a single story from the Bible. A single story is not reflective of the human experience. Hearing one person's perspective narrows our viewpoint and influences us into thinking that a person or an event should be viewed in only one way, with one outcome. Hearing a single story means we miss all the other stories, all the other colors. Perhaps John talks about the linen so much because that moment stands out in his mind. He remembers the disciples running to the tomb, not wanting to believe Mary, praying and hoping that the body was still there, and then they see it, the cloth from Jesus' head wrapped carefully on the floor, and they know the body of the Lord is gone. And Matthew, I think his story describes a message. Do not be afraid, repeated twice by the angel and then by Jesus. Do not be afraid. Tell your brothers that Jesus has risen. Again and again, spread the message that there is hope and there is faith, that when death and defeat knock on your door, life is there afterwards, different and renewed. Two different stories. And as inconsistent as they are with the details, the stories speak to important pieces of a moment that changed the course of people's lives forever. From each story, I discern a multitude of different emotions: fear, joy, shock, and hope. From each story, I learned that there were many people involved in the life of Jesus, following him, loving him, and caring for his body after death. People who wanted to be connected with the news of his disappearance and who needed to share in the message of hope. And these stories tell me that the resurrection is meaningful. As Christians, we hold close to us the story of the resurrection because it's beautiful and tragic and empowering. The story has many different layers, and all of them are true. So I believe it is our responsibility then, as progressive Christians, to lift up the kaleidoscope to the Bible so everyone can hear multiple different stories. Because it is the incredible weaving together of an abundance of perspectives that creates meaning and understanding in stories and experiences. So if we open ourselves to the possibility that many stories can be true at the same time, then we lift ourselves up collectively in the recognition that we all experience the world differently and that God sustains us in our diversity. I know that we seek to see the Holy Spirit in every individual. So let us be filled with the openness today, and as we leave today, let us be filled with the openness to lift up multiple stories that empower people and that humanize us all together. Amen.